of the removal of coalition combat forces scheduled for 2014. Afghan President Hamid Karzai is in Washington this week to meet with the president and other senior administration officials. This is an hour and a half.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We welcome you to the Atlantic Council. We're delighted to have you all. We're delighted to have our distinguished guests. It's pretty rare, I think, that you get three extraordinary ambassadors sitting next to one another, each of whom has tremendous familiarity with the subject. The Council itself has been working on these issues for quite a number of years. This is actually the 4th anniversary of our South Asia Center. Some of you may remember a few years ago, the Council did a very substantial report with respect to Afghanistan. The then head of the Council, who then became the National Security Advisor, General Jim Jones, was involved. Some of the people in the audience were involved, Harlan Ullman and others. And we followed up on that work continuously over the last several years. This is the latest installment, if you will. I think that we all know that we are at an inflection point with respect to Afghanistan. A lot of important decisions coming. President Karzai is here to meet with President Obama. That meeting will take place on Friday. And what is said here, I'm sure, will absolutely shape the contours of that meeting. We have Ambassador James Dobbins, who was the former U.S. Ambassador to Afghanistan, among many other things. He's now at the RAND Institute. We have Ambassador Khan, who, among others, other posts, was the foreign minister. Also, I believe, is the ambassador to China. We have Ambassador Jawad, who was the ambassador of Afghanistan to the United States, all of whom have been intimately involved with respect to the important issues regarding Afghanistan, with respect to the important issues regarding the region. We called the event Back to the Future. Some people have spoken to me before about this, what did we really mean by that. I think we'll let that emerge as the discussion goes on, but we know we have a lot of fundamental issues to talk about. Certainly, the military presence has been an issue that has been talked about in the newspapers a lot, but governance is an important issue. Regional issues are an important issue. Economics are an important issue. Some technical issues, such as what kind of agreements might be signed between the United States and Afghanistan, are important. The role of Pakistan, and many others. So with that, let me turn to our three speakers, each of whom will speak for somewhere between 6 and 10 minutes, roughly speaking. And then we're going to open it up to questions and dialogue with respect to the audience. Let me start with Jim, if you're ready, and give you the floor, sir.
Well, thank you, Frank. My responsibilities for Afghanistan go back to 2001, and I think it's fair to say that I was present at the creation of at least the current regime in Kabul. So I start by looking back and trying to spot the things we did wrong at the time. And it strikes me that there were three fundamental errors, two of which I perceived at the time and tried to do something about, and one of which I failed to perceive entirely and did nothing about. One was the decision not to deploy any American or international peacekeepers in the country. We had a country that had no police force and no army, and we decided that security would be an Afghan responsibility in the aftermath of the fall of the Taliban. I think that was a major mistake. A second was to allow the coalition that we'd successfully built for the war and for the peace conference, for the Bonn conference, disintegrate. Iran had been very helpful. We rebuffed offers of further help. Pakistan had at least been not actively unhelpful, but we failed to keep them up to that standard in the succeeding years. The third error, which I failed to perceive, was a failure to pursue reconciliation much earlier than we finally did. There were a certain proportion of the Taliban leadership that were prepared to be co-opted, that would have collaborated in the new arrangements. And instead we sent them to Bagram or to Guantanamo and sent a very negative signal to those who might consider co-opting and being co-opted into the new system. And it took us almost a decade to reverse that policy. Nevertheless, despite these problems and despite the fact that now, more than 10 years on, we're still engaged in a counterinsurgency campaign in Afghanistan. I think we have come a longer way than many of us realize. And I think some of this is reflected in a recent poll that the Asia Society put out just a couple of weeks ago, which showed, in contradistinction to American opinion about Afghanistan, or indeed American opinion about America, a fairly high degree of optimism. 52% of Afghans think their country's going in the right direction. This is up from last year, interestingly, not down. 53% of them say they're more prosperous now than they were 5 years ago. You know, the reasons that they cite are better security, more schools, more reconstruction. Now, it's also interesting to point out that the non-optimistic side, it's not 48% because there's some who are just undecided, but the non-optimistic side cited worse security as their concern. So there clearly are differences in perception. Interestingly, support for reconciliation, for co-opting the Taliban, bringing them into the political process, is at 81%, very high. Not that high in the Tajik and Uzbek communities as in the Pashtun communities, but still well over 50%, even in those communities. Confidence in the Afghan National Army, 93%. In the police, 82%. In the government itself, 75%. Those figures compare pretty favorably to comparable polling in the United States about confidence in our own institutions. Interestingly, 79% of the people think that the government is corrupt. So it's not just that they were giving the pollsters the answers they thought the pollsters wanted. They were quite critical of the government. But they also seem to have a more balanced approach. They can cite the government as on balance better than most they've experienced in their lifetime, while at the same time feeling that it's very corrupt and that something ought to be done about it. The polls after the presidential election of several years ago showed the same results. That is, most Afghans thought the Karzai's presidential election had been very corrupt, and most of them were very satisfied with the result. And so they could hold both concepts, which our own media seems unable to do. We recently did a study which I think puts Afghanistan in some perspective. That is RAND. It's about to be published. We looked at 20 post-conflict reconstruction efforts, both peacekeeping and peace enforcement efforts. The big American ones: Bosnia, Kosovo, Somalia, Haiti, Iraq, Afghanistan, and the mostly smaller UN ones in a dozen or more other places. So we looked at 20 of them. And we evaluated them on a number of criteria. One was, did they produce peace, which was, after all, why most of them were deployed in the first place. But also, did they produce more democratization? And we used Freedom House scores to rank them. Did they produce better government? And we used World Bank indices as a government effectiveness index. Every year they rate every government in the world. Did the economy expand? Again, just World Bank and IMF figures. And did the lot of the citizens improve? And there we used the UNDP's Human Development Index, which looks at both levels of income, but also at education and health and other criteria. In democratization, Afghanistan didn't pass the peace test, and 16 of the 20 cases did. So that's definitely a failure. In democratization, it was about in the middle in terms of how much it had democratized. It had improved its Freedom House score by 15%. In government effectiveness, interestingly, and counter-distinction to everything we hear about it, it ranks second of the 20 countries. It had the second highest improvement. It wasn't the second highest in the end, but it improved. Its rate of improvement was the second highest. In per capita GDP, again, it was second highest. Per capita GDP has increased by 130% since 2001. And interestingly, in the Human Development Index, it was the highest. Of all 20, it showed the greatest improvement in human development, which is a combination of standard of living, education, health, those kinds of criteria. And so I think it's pretty easy to see why Afghans tend to be more optimistic than we think they should be. And indeed, in many cases, more optimistic than Americans about America's own future. Longevity is way up, infant mortality is way down, literacy is up. If the number of Afghan children that are in school today stay in school for 10 years, Afghanistan's literacy rate will be 3 times higher than it is today. Now, the polls, of course, and the Asia Society notes this, didn't poll in some of the areas that were most violent, and so the numbers would probably be, and almost certainly would be lower in some of those areas, and so one has to account for that. But the number of areas which they failed to poll in are still fairly limited. There was a long story in the New York Times today on the front page about how about levels of anxiety about the NATO troop withdrawals. And the story is written about the most exposed areas, the areas that were last cleared and will be the most exposed to Taliban return. And the story is about high levels of anxiety and concern and pessimism. And I'm not arguing that that isn't correct. I'm simply arguing that it's not reflective of the attitude in most of the country insofar as it can be determined. Now, just to end on what we're looking forward to, clearly there are 2 transitions coming up. There's the transition from a U.S. and NATO-led combat operations to Afghan-led combat operations, and the transition from Karzai-led government to somebody else-led government. And of the 2 transitions, the latter is by far the more dangerous, the more difficult, and the more uncertain. I mean, I don't think the Afghan army is going to run away in 2014. But it's possible the Afghan government will collapse in 2014 as the result of a failed transition. And by that I don't mean that the election will be irregular necessarily. I think a regular election could produce a very unstable result. I mean, it's a two-round system. And so it's quite plausible that you'd have the first round, you'd have 25 candidates, that in the first round none of them would get more than 10% of the vote, that you'd then have a second round between 2 candidates, neither of whom had more than 10% of the vote. Mathematically, one of them would win, but he'd win with a constituency of only 10% of the country. And that kind of result probably would not be enough to hold the country together. I think the concern about corruption in the government is accurate, real, and valid, but it does miss the point that it's as much corruption as formal institutions that hold that country together. Karzai has built an effective patronage network that allows him to exert a significant degree of influence across sectarian lines in that country and across geographic lines in the country. And formal institutions, the kind that have been built, not without some success since 2001, simply aren't up to exerting that degree of control and influence. And so the big question is, can a successor both assume control over the formal institutions of governance, but also have a broad enough patronage network, a political machine, in enough of the country so that he'll be able to at least replicate Karzai's success in this regard. And I think as we tend to evaluate the forthcoming transition in Afghanistan, that's the question we need to be asking ourselves.
Jim, thanks very much. I think that puts out a lot of food for thought, to say the least. Let me turn, please, next to Ambassador Khan.
Thank you. At the outset, let me say that the year 2012 has clarified some of the situations which we are discussing today. For example, there is an improvement of relationship between US and Pakistan. There is better coordination between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And also there appears to be a better clarity in the US positions relating to the two very important questions, which is withdrawal and reconciliation. I'll offer a few comments which are based on my experience as being part of the Foreign Office until early 2008, and then later on as an observer. I do not have any other formal association with the Pakistan government. Well, Pakistan, like several other players in the region, have made policy mistakes. Pakistan has suffered, but it is not all on account of its flawed policies, but there are many other dimensions to the conflict in the region. Afghans, I would also say that they cannot place the blame for all the problems that there are onto others. The first point that I would like to emphasize here, because this has been talked about quite a bit in the past, not as much now. I have not met in the last several years, even while I was in the Foreign Office, any responsible person from the civilian leadership or the military leadership who would be seeking strategic depth in Afghanistan, or who would be considering the Taliban as an asset for the future. The foreign minister of late and even the army chief, they have basically rejected these notions. But I'll not go into the details of these. As far as Taliban are concerned, there is no question of their returning to Kabul or getting revived the way they did in the mid-1990s. There are many reasons for this. One can go into the details, but I'll skip it for the moment. But there is one thing. Pakistan could not treat the Taliban as it treated Al-Qaeda. And this is a point which I think the Afghans who know the demographics and the history, intertwined history and the cultural traditions, will appreciate as much as any Pakistani would. The Taliban remain part of the Afghan political landscape, but here there was a disconnect between the Pakistani position and the US position right after 9/11. And I think the Ambassador Dobbins has made a remark that Pakistan's position was not unhelpful. If it was not helpful, the thing is that even at that time, Pakistan had argued that reconcilable Taliban should be brought into the fold of the Bonn process. But anyway, that is past. On this count, there have been many misunderstandings, and I would say that even unfair accusations that Pakistan has been engaged in double dealing, etc. But as I said, Pakistan could not treat the Afghan Taliban or the Afghan Taliban leadership the way it treated Al-Qaeda. Now, of course, the situation after 2009, when the American position towards reconciliation and also towards Taliban by that token started changing, so the situation is a bit different. I would say that after a period of certain tentativeness, today the reconciliation efforts appears to be Afghan-led, which it ought to be. Pakistan and United States, they can play a supportive role. Pakistan should be positive and helpful, but it should not be eager, because eagerness can very easily be misinterpreted as having its own agenda trying to interfere or trying to support one party or the other. Also, at the same time, I would say that there should not be any unrealistic expectations from Pakistan with regard to the Taliban. We can persuade them to do certain things, but there are limitations. I would say that the Afghans generally, we had the experience of the Mujahideen as well. They, at critical times, they never accepted our advice or our point of view. The Taliban should be free to talk to anyone that they want. They can also stay in Pakistan, like many, several Afghans who are there. But certainly they ought not to misuse this hospitality. And here Pakistan has to be in the future very firm. And Pakistan, I would say, and Afghanistan, they should coordinate and cooperate with each other in controlling cross-border militancy. I personally believe that there is no conventional threat to either Pakistan or to Afghanistan along this border, except the kind of threat that both face on account of the extremism and militancy. Finally, I would have a couple of observations about the question of U.S. forces withdrawal and the post 2014 scenario. The question of residual U.S. presence is being discussed now in Washington at the highest level. Much depends on the status of force agreement, which is a complex political matter for President Karzai. As regards Pakistan, Pakistan ought to accept whatever is decided between the US and the Afghan government. However, from Pakistan's point of view, the downside of continued US presence is that it will continue to provide an argument for militants to justify their violent activities. This is the downside as we look at it. But as I said, it is for the US government and the Afghan government, not for Pakistan. Pakistan should accept whatever it is. There are usually, now these are my personal view, there are usually two arguments which are made in support of continued US military presence after 2014. That it is necessary to keep the Afghan army intact and together, and that it is necessary for counter-terrorism operations like drones, operation of drones, etc. The first argument that Afghan National Army, I think the Afghan National Army has already shown its ability to withstand effectively any attacks from the Taliban, and this was quite evident last year, I think in April, when the Taliban launched a spring offensive, and it was basically the Afghan National Army which was able to counter it very effectively. No army can, however, prevent sporadic violent activity, bomb blasts, etc. Pakistan army has not been able to do that. But these kinds of activities, they do not lead to collapse or overthrow of political systems and governments. They cause a lot of pain, no doubt. So even one of the transitions that Ambassador Doman mentioned, that the government may fall, but here we have to see whether the system will collapse. The system, there is the system which has been in place, and Ambassador Doman had a great contribution to that by the Bonn process. That I don't think is in the danger of any collapse. So I personally don't see any reason why the Afghan National Army should not be able to pull on its own without the support of coalition troops, effectively counter any significant military assault by the Taliban or any other military force. You might recall that even Najibullah, after the Soviet troop withdrawal, was able to withstand the Mujahideen attacks and Mujahideen forces, which were far more organized in that context. It was only after the Soviet Union collapsed that Najibullah regime fell. As for drones, the one comment I would make is that this presents a kind of a paradox or a dilemma, that it serves both as a cure and also as a cause for aggravation of the malaise. And those who have been reading about these know it quite well. To counter extremism and militancy, what is required by both Pakistan and Afghanistan is to address this challenge, closely cooperate with each other. They also need to fully realize that this continuation of this conflict is disastrous for both of them. There is, in my view, no rosy scenario after 2014. There is no silver bullet which will end the violence and the conflict neatly and quickly. What one can hope is that the conflict and violence will taper off with time. The outside players have a role, but that is essentially to help development of Afghan economy. Reconstruction and economic development will generate its own dynamic and for stabilization. The outside players can best contribute by keeping in check their rivalries and scrutinizing their concerns with greater diligence, because sometimes these concerns lead to measures which only compound problems. The Afghans, in my view, alone can take care of their politics, their governance, and their security. In these areas, outside role has often compounded problems and complications. There can be many other issues like trade, economy, etc., but we can probably address them in question answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. That's a very interesting perspective, and I think we'll get a lot of questions on that. Ambassador Jawad?
Thank you very much. It's an honor being in this panel, and I appreciate the opportunity. In the interest, I just want to make one point clear that whatever I say, it's my opinion. I do not represent actually the Afghan government or anyone in Afghanistan, any political formations. Some important points were raised about Afghanistan. I just want to put the major transition that Afghanistan is going through in a macro perspective. Basically, what we are facing in Afghanistan, we are going through 4 transitions. We're going through a political transition, an economic transition, a social transition, and a security transition. And every one of these transitions provides its own challenges and opportunities. It's to the political transition, which is the upcoming elections in Afghanistan. The good news is that President Karzai clearly indicated that he is not running. And Afghan Election Commission have put forward a very clear and detailed timetable for the upcoming elections. And there's a lot of political activities in Afghanistan. Different parties, different groups are getting together, they're talking to each other. The challenge with the political transition is that, first, we don't have a political party system so that we can prepare institutionally and properly for the political transition. That's one challenge. The second challenge is that as much as these political leaders in Afghanistan are getting together and talking to each other, no one is really taking a lead to take a clear position on certain national issues because of the uncertainty surrounding Afghanistan on one hand, and on the other hand, of course, as you can expect, President Karzai being the sitting president, even if he does not want to run for the presidency, he wants to have the most important influence on determining the succession and the outcome of the transition. And therefore, I don't think he's going to endorse any person soon, because as soon as he endorses a person or a political force, he will become lame duck. People will align themselves for or against that group or that person. So naturally, he would delay that process of clearly indicating where he stands on that issue of elections and successions. The other challenge is that our elections in the past were both funded and supervised by the international community. This time, Afghanistan wants the international community to stay completely out of the elections, both in the term of monitoring, but also in terms of funding, which creates a lot of anxiety, both inside Afghanistan and outside Afghanistan, as to the financial ability, but also the technical ability of the Afghans to run the elections. The second transition is the economic transition in Afghanistan. We are transitioning from a contract economy, from aid dependency, into a private sector-led economy. And that transition is fortunately going much better than thought. I am involved in that as part of the work that I do. I travel very frequently to Afghanistan. So a lot of the companies who, for instance, made a lot of money working for major contractors doing major construction projects in Afghanistan, roads and airports and the likes, now they're shifting into housing, into other areas, into mining. So they're adjusting themselves and aligning themselves into the new realities. And of course, the good one will survive, and there will be some adjustment. But there's a lot more positive economic activities taking place in Afghanistan that makes us a lot more hopeful for that transition to take place more successfully. Of course, there are impediments. Still, access to capital is difficult. The reintegration of Afghanistan into the regional economy has its challenges. A lot of those challenges are political, not so much economic. We still have issues with our transit through Pakistan. Still, our trade with Central Asia could be much, much bigger than it is actually right now. And in both cases, it's not really the infrastructure, it's just the policies that makes it difficult. And therefore, it's easier to overcome that challenge because we have to have better policies. The social transition in Afghanistan is a new generation of Afghans, young Afghan leaders taking charge of the country. And you can see this. Used to be when we travel in Afghanistan, and I traveled in Afghanistan in different parts of the country, all the complaints was, yes, about corruption, about U.S. military operation, about warlords, you name it. Now when I travel, people are complaining about issues like the internet is too slow, or access to internet is too expensive. A different discourse is being introduced among young Afghans, or it's difficult to get visas to travel outside Afghanistan, all of which is good news, actually. People are becoming more connected or are eager to be more connected. And we see the new generation of Afghans emerging. Just last week, the Foundation for Afghanistan, which I established, brought about 30 students actually to Washington, into the White House. And when you listen to these kids and what they dream of and what they want to do for Afghanistan is very hopeful, it's very enlightening. But the most important transition, which also acquired a lot of attention here in Afghanistan, is the security transition. The transition of taking responsibility by the Afghans from international forces. Here also, Ambassador Dobbins indicated that the capability of the Afghan security forces are better than thought, actually, especially the Afghan National Army. The Afghan police force still has its own challenges. And in provinces where transition is taking place, people are not particularly worried about the fact that the transition is now being carried out by Afghan forces. But what people are worried the most, and it's the biggest challenge in Afghanistan, is not so much insecurity as uncertainty. What's going to happen to our country? What's going to happen to us? When you go in Bamyan province and ask people that what if the New Zealander left from the province, they said, oh, we will probably be fine, but we don't know what's going to happen in Kabul. So it's the political uncertainty. We don't get a clear message from our international partners or our political leadership on what are we transitioning to on the bigger picture. Where are we going? How are we going to fit in this new world that's emerging around us with instability in Pakistan, hostility in Iran, demand for raw material in China, emergence of India as an important economic power? How do we fit in all of that? That's what is missing. That's what is missing, and we don't hear a clear message on neither from our political leadership nor from our international partners on that issue. But what is important on the security, and I just want to touch upon them shortly, and what makes the security transition successful are three factors. First is reconciliation. Would we be able to succeed on this? Do we have a vision, a clear vision about reconciliation, first among ourselves, meaning about Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the United States, on where the red lines are? What are the parameters of the compromise? Who are terrorists? Who are the good Talibans? Who are the bad Talibans? And to what extent we are ready to compromise? We have to reach this kind of agreement among ourselves as Afghans, as a nation, and then with Pakistan, the United States as our ally, and then to go to the other side of the table and talk with Taliban. That's key for success and reconciliation. Another issue that is taking a lot of attention, of course, and impacting the ability of the Afghan security forces is the insider attack. And it's sometimes people are disappointed and says, well, how could this happen? And how could they actually turn the guns against us while we train them? And then again, this is an important issue because, as the Taliban have indicated, that's their most successful tactic. It undermines trust between the Afghan security forces and the international security forces, and it's really the most effective way of destabilizing Afghan security forces. The reason for that's key to know why it's happening. First reason is infiltration. Of course, they purposefully infiltrate. We have low recruitment criteria. We don't have a strong national data system to look after who is coming in. So infiltration is the first part. Second part is intimidation. When people are enlisting to the National Army or Police Force, Taliban are contacting their parents, their family, and their other, threatening them. And especially when you are in an environment of uncertainty, when people says, well, you know, the international community might be leaving, the security might deteriorate, so it's easier for these people to be intimidated and switch side. Also, impersonation and using uniforms. I see a lot of people here that have been in Kabul, and I've met them there. So you can easily buy an Afghan army uniform or police force uniform on the market easily. Not only in Afghan, you can even buy ISAF uniforms if you're looking for it hard in Kabul. So that's the other part is impersonation, but also copycat, mentally ill, unstable individuals who, once they hear about it, like in here, sometimes you see when it's a increase in the crime because people, when you see something, they copy that. They think this is something cool or something acceptable. But of course, rage and revenge. Sometimes the soldiers are personally mistreated. But the last factor is, of course, what they call jihad also, thinking that this is the right cause of action, this is the right way to action. But so it's a complex phenomena, and I'm not going to go about how to deal with it, but if needed, we can talk about it. And just last point on the number of the troops. A lot of discussions, we've heard from 50,000 down to 0, back and forth. And so what I think should determine the number of the troop in Afghanistan, not so much the economic constraint of the United States or the political reality for the fact that the Afghan mission is not popular. It should be a combination of all three. First, a definition of the mission. What the United States and NATO wants to accomplish in Afghanistan. If the mission is clearly defined, then we can say that this will take so much troops, so many troops. And I know that definition is now more confined into a counter-terrorist presence in Afghanistan, a CT presence, not so much of a counter-insurgency which will be carried out by Afghan. But again, the question is, who is a terrorist? Is Al-Qaeda, is Lashkar-e-Taiba, is Haqqani included on that or not? A clear definition on that will determine how many troops will be needed. So I don't want to run over my time, but I would love to discuss some of these issues in more detail if there is interest. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think we've got a pretty comprehensive layout. Let me ask a question to start off to each of the speakers, and then I'm going to open up to the audience. So let me start with Ambassador Jawad. You mentioned 4 transitions. From a perspective of the outsiders, whether it's the U.S., NATO, World Bank, Pakistan, et cetera, what would be the most helpful thing in your perspective for either all or any of the particular transitions that outsiders could undertake?
I think the most important role that the international community generally could play is the economic transition. That's what makes actually the political transition possible, in the security transition sustainable. And for this, what is needed is working more closely to reintegrate Afghanistan into the regional economy. This includes actually enhancing and building more power grid. Pakistan needs power. There is excess energy in Central Asia. Afghanistan needs power. And if we create an interdependency between these countries, especially the countries that are not on the friendly term with each other, we will enhance the chances of stability a lot more. So it includes also is a more expensive projects, could be pipeline and others, but at least the national grid, railroads. Fortunately now Pakistan is extending its railroad into Torkham and into Kandahar, and our other Iranian have come to Herat and the railroad from Central Asia has reached Mazar-e-Sharif, to connect now across of railroad into Afghanistan, north and south, so we can really rebuild Afghanistan as a crossroad or a roundabout of trade. That's key. Internally, improving access to capital in Afghanistan by providing some political incentives in terms of political risk insurance, making actually more credit available for investment by international companies in Afghanistan, allowing some Afghan companies to have access to easier credit. These are the key issues that could help Afghanistan on the economic front. But more importantly, a clear message about the future of Afghanistan that will give the investors and everyone else a sense of confidence to come in, invest, and work in Afghanistan.
Thank you. Ambassador Khan, you mentioned, for example, with respect to Pakistan, that it's important for Pakistan to work with Afghanistan to control cross-border incidents. Do you think that Pakistan, along the lines that Ambassador Jawad just mentioned, can also work in some other areas like reconciliation, like regional economics? Are those things that are available to do, or to some extent, if I heard you correctly, you wanted to make sure that Pakistan didn't jump in too quickly, didn't appear too eager, didn't affect? And would love to have you elaborate a little bit more on the role you see Pakistan playing with respect to issues like economics, reconciliation, and the like.
Yeah, when it comes to reconciliation, I would say that Pakistan has a role, not because it claims to have a role, but because of demographics, because of the fact that the Taliban leadership, like the Mujahideen leadership earlier in the 80s and the 90s, happened to be in Pakistan. So this is a kind of a role which has become a kind of obligation. But what is it that Pakistan can do? We can apply some pressure, some persuasion, but if the expectation is that we can arm twist anybody to accept any position, that will not be possible for Pakistan. This is one point. The second, about the eagerness, the moment you show eagerness, then there are many red lights everywhere. That what is it that Pakistan is trying to do? If, for example, there was a comment that I had made that we should not be seeking a place on the table. There is no need for us because our role is there. It is well established. But if we try to that in reconciliation, we must have a part. We must play a part. Then surely it is going to be misinterpreted. Unfortunately, we have a role and we should play that role. And I think those who want us to play the role, they must also understand our limitations. As far as the economic part is concerned, yes, there ought to be cooperation, but unfortunately, because of conflict in Afghanistan and because of conflict now, which also engulfs Pakistan, there are difficulties. And earlier we had thought in the 90s that if the Afghan conflict would somehow get resolved, then there would be communication lines open between Pakistan and Central Asia. There are many projects like the TAPI, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India gas pipeline. If something can be done on that, that would be a great project. There are projects for transmission lines from Central Asia through Afghanistan, and also development in Afghanistan, supplying energy to Pakistan. So there are all these things which certainly can be developed.
Thank you very much. Jim, you've spent a fair amount of time in your career in the Situation Room or otherwise in the White House. The President has the talks coming up with President Karzai on Friday. If you were there, again, back in the Situation Room, developing the positions that might be suggested to him, what would be the 2 or 3 points that you would make with respect to the talks?
Well, as Ambassador Jawad indicated, that the concerns are in Afghanistan are less concerns about current levels of security or even current levels of development, and more about uncertainty with respect to the future. And so I think the degree to which one can address that by laying out a future course for American engagement and broader international engagement, the better. Now, the obstacle to that, at least in part, is Karzai's desire to drive the hardest bargain possible, and some of his objectives seem to be rather unreasonable and even in some cases undesirable. So this is not something that's entirely in the administration's hands. I think it's tactically. It's recently, yesterday, I guess, put out a statement that it's open to having no American presence at all in Afghanistan, military presence, after 2014. That seems a tactical move designed to indicate to Karzai that he has less leverage in this negotiation than he might otherwise. I personally, I believe that that it would be prudent to arrange for a fairly substantial presence if we're able to do so. But it is important that we avoid the kind of situation we had in Iraq, where we didn't ask the Iraqis what they thought or what they wanted until fairly late in the process. And as a result, not only did we fail to achieve an agreement which would allow us to retain a military presence, but we also created the possibility of providing the Iraqis a whole range of assistance and advisory programs through our civilian side that they didn't want, and as a result, we spent a lot of money and a lot of effort to create capabilities which, in the end, the Iraqis didn't avail themselves of. So that the earlier that we can come to some understanding with the Afghans, difficult as it is, about what they want, and on that basis decide what we're prepared to provide, the better. Now, in terms of how the troop presence issue, my view is it's a straight cost-risk ratio. The more you're prepared to pay, the lower your risk, the higher your risk tolerance, the less you can get away with. What's irresponsible is to argue that you can have low costs and low risks. So if you want 2,000 troops instead of 10,000 troops, you just accept a much higher risk that you're not going to achieve whatever objectives you've set for yourselves. And the minimal objective is Afghanistan not again fall to a regime that's linked to and allied with Al-Qaeda. And the lower you go, the higher the risk. What the risk is, I don't know. It may be small, but it'll be higher if you choose a lower number, and it'll be lower if you choose a higher number. Now, I care for my personal involvement more about Afghanistan than most Americans, so I'd favor high cost, low risk. After all, I only pay 1/300 millionth of the cost, and everybody else has to pay the rest. Most Americans don't have that link. They've been there 10 years. They're tired of it, and they'll probably choose high risk, low cost.
Let me open this up to the audience. I believe we're going to have microphones, so if you would just say your name and then address your question to any of the panel you like. And I'll start with Harlan Ullman.
I'm Harlan Ullman. Thank you for a very enlightened discussion. The report that Frank Kramer mentioned came out about 5 years ago began, make no mistake, NATO is losing in Afghanistan. We slightly soften that to say that, make no mistake, the West is not winning. But my question really comes off that pessimism, because quite frankly, I'm much, much more pessimistic, particularly concerning the security transition. Barring some wild card events, India, Pakistan, and that is not looking particularly good, or an attack on Iran, which would change the calculus. It seems to me that the level of American and Western forces required to support the Afghan army, and I agree with Ambassador Jawad, the police are a different and a much more difficult situation, by some counts would require probably in excess of 50,000 people, including contractors, because the Afghan army has got no air, it's got no fire support, it's got no medical support, logistics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. On top of that, the salaries are going to run somewhere around $4 billion a year. Who's going to pay them? My sense, to add to this pessimism, is that the Obama administration is very likely not to cut and run, but cut and walk. And you see these signs in the press right now to get down to a much lower level. The number of 6,000 is around. But if those things were to take place, how does the Afghan security forces really operate without the support it needs in terms of air, in terms of logistics, in terms of fires, in terms of pay? especially when virtually every NATO country really wants to get out as quickly as possible. And we could see a quicker decline in Western presence in 2013 rather than 2014.
Would you like to discuss that first?
Thank you very much. Yeah, this is a legitimate concern. In fact, our defense minister is here in town today at the Pentagon. He's discussing some of these issues. He has come with a detailed list of the enablers that the Afghan National Army needs, including, as you've mentioned, actually long-range artillery, intelligence gathering capabilities, and fixed-wing and rotary aircrafts for transportation, because we've been completely dependent on all of these things to NATO and our other friends and allies. But again, a lot of these equipments are not as expensive as conducting this operation with the NATO equipments in Afghanistan. So if there is a political will, it's doable. And same thing as far as the salaries of the Afghan National Army and Police. Yes, it is a significant number considering the Afghan economy. But for the withdrawal of each international troop from Afghanistan, we can maintain and sustain 80 Afghan National Army soldiers on the ground if there is a willingness to continue with this mission, and as you mentioned, to come with a more reasonable definition of success in Afghanistan, which has been generally up to now been degrading and been diminished, actually, what it means to succeed in Afghanistan.
The end of the first row. Right there.
I'm Will Embry from DynCorp International. I'd really like to understand a little bit better about the Indian part of this triangle. The Pakistanis, we hear about that more in the press, what's going on the ground. My understanding is that the Indians are really very active there, and it's really a triangular relationship between Pakistan, India, and Afghanistan. I'd love to hear Ambassador Jawad talk a bit more about that.
And I think, if you'd like, also perhaps Ambassador Khan.
Thank you very much. India has been an important friend of Afghanistan, a historic friend and ally of Afghanistan. They are not only involved in enhancing the reconstruction pace in Afghanistan, they are providing scholarships for more than 1,000 Afghans every year to different Indian universities, which is key to building human capital in Afghanistan. There were actually some, initially in the past few years, there were some hesitations on the part of the United States, particularly because of the sensitivity that exists in Pakistan about India's role in Afghanistan, not to get India involved in the training of our security forces and in other issues. This is diminishing more and more. I think there is a more realism indicating that at the end of the day, India and China, both in Pakistan, have an important role to play in stability in Afghanistan. So we have signed a strategic partnership agreement with India, which initially was an issue. Should we do that? Because it may actually antagonize further Pakistan if we do this. Definitely, India has a much bigger role to play, provided that some of the bigger conflict that exists in our region, particularly in Kashmir and with Pakistan, are left out of this issue. Because at the end of the day, we think that a stable Afghanistan is a better friend of Pakistan. And in a weak and unstable Afghanistan will endanger Pakistan as much as it endangers Afghanistan. But definitely India is a major donor. They are providing more than $2 billion economic assistance. And they are getting also more interested to get involved in training of the Afghan security forces in a professional level, like the professional cadre of the police and others, not so much with the Afghan National Army, which needs to continue either through the United States or some of our NATO partners to provide a continuity of what we have started together.
Ambassador Khan, did you want to say a few words?
I certainly agree with Ambassador Jawad that a stable Afghanistan is in the best interest of Pakistan and also the region. And whatever can be done to accelerate the process of stabilization, that must be done. And here, as you have also mentioned earlier, that what the international community can do, and here Pakistan and India can also do, is contribute to the economic development. The economic aspect should be, and here whatever India is doing, that Pakistan simply cannot have any reservations to that, which is good. It helps. But and Pakistan itself is also doing. We have about 2,000 scholarships that we offer. Then we have also these refugees whom we would like that they should go back, but they still continue to be in Pakistan, more than 3 million. The one aspect is the army. And here, if the Indians start training the Afghan army, then there are concerns, and they should be understandable. They should be appreciated by the Afghans and others. And why the Afghan army cannot be trained by NATO, for example? Why not by countries like Turkey or United States, for that matter? Why do you have to have something where then people within Pakistan, some people, rightly or wrongly, might say that, look, we are facing a two-front situation. So that is why we have that concern. Apart from that, nothing else.
The second row over here.
Hello,
Yes, sir.
Ambassador Jawad. I think I very. My name, by the way, is Ziad. Hello.
You're okay.
My name is Ziad. I'm the former director of operations at the World Bank. I like your comment, Ambassador Jawad, about the fact that the economic prosperity is probably the single most important aspect of the transition. But when we are talking about this, we're speaking about long-term schemes, linkages, pipelines, and so forth. In rehabilitation of countries, the World Bank has taken a lead oftentimes in countries in Latin America, Eastern Europe, etc., and many others. In fact, even in Pakistan, where short-term schemes, rural development, urban development schemes, social development schemes have been put into action, which have a lead time for results, which are very much shorter than the long schemes we talk of. To what extent in Afghanistan are those kinds of schemes being applied? Because to my mind, in addition to the parallel track of the long schemes, we do need in the short term the shorter schemes, which again addresses some of the other concerns about security. Because wherever there is, of course, poverty and lack of opportunity, that's also the opportunity for the Taliban and other such agencies to come and show their bit. So to what extent is Afghanistan, in fact, focusing on some of the short-term development schemes?
Thank you very much, Mr. Al. That's a very good point. As you know, actually, when you implement large-scale infrastructure projects, they usually don't have an owner. There's no community that relates to them right away, and therefore it's more expensive to maintain them, because if you build like a Kabul-Kandahar highway, and no community along the road says this is my road, while it is serve all the community that's there. And for the stability operation, you have to create this need that the community thinks this is my project, and this is for me, and it helps me, and I can see myself reflected on that. For that, the World Bank actually assisted us extensively to implement the National Solidarity Program on the rural development, which was projects designed actually based on the priority of the community. There was a development actually, Shura, the Development Council, they're still around. These Development Council will determine what their priorities are, and then the money is being provided to them by the Afghan government, but the construction and the oversight is done by the community. So they feel that they're responsible. But yes, those undertakings are very, very important. They're key. Of course, sometimes they have their own challenges. When you work at the community level, for instance, and allow these projects to be implemented, sometimes the community may tolerate actually the presence of the Taliban around the project. And then the donor community comes in and says, look, how can you do this? We give you the money, then you're still actually allowing Taliban to kind of roam around or be around this. This is a harder balance to reach, but there is absolutely the microfinance projects have been very, very key in not only actually for economic empowerment of the deprived community, but also for gender equality. And the National Solidarity Program has been like a model, in fact, in Afghanistan, to reach out to a smaller rural community.
The back row there, fifth row back.
Thank you. I'm Rajesh Kadian. I run a U.S.-India Security Forum. And my question is naturally directed towards you, Mr. Ambassador. The first is a comment. The Indo-Afghan strategic partnership was signed by mutual hesitation between both parties. Nobody rushed into it. And that's my comment. My question is related to the ANA. Its ethnic composition and to its training and support, which Ambassador Khan opposes India's role in. Would you comment on the Afghans' role in it, please? Thank you.
And Jim, I might ask you to talk a little bit about how you see NATO's role longer term.
Ethnic composition of the Afghan National Security Forces, when the recruitment process started and the security situation was not as challenging as it is today. So a lot of the people enlisted from the provinces, mainly from the south and the north, and one reason, and then also some of the leadership of the Ministry of Defense belonged to the people in the south and the north. So in the beginning, there were some imbalances in the composition and the formation of the Ministry of Defense in the Afghan security forces. Now there is actually an extensive effort. There's a system put in place, and there's extensive efforts to particularly recruit from the provinces in the south. Some of these efforts are successful, but as you can imagine, if you put yourself as a young man in Afghanistan, if you enlist as an Afghan police officer or army officer in Helmand or in Kandahar, you face different level of threat than someone in Bamyan, because the province is quiet, there is the environment, the Taliban are not operating, therefore there is less threat against you and your family. So therefore, despite the efforts that's being made, we still have challenges to recruit members of the Afghan National Security Forces from those provinces. Honestly, when we bring even students to the United States right now, and we purposely go after actually and try to recruit students from south or from places where is the most work, there is, since the school system is not up to the standard, there's their English, their TOEFL score, it doesn't match. They do, even despite our efforts, we are not successful to bring them as much as we want them.
Jim, do you want to talk a little bit about these issues?
Well, in terms of who advises the Afghan National Army, back in 2001, we actually had a plethora of offers. The Pakistani, the Indian, and the Iranian governments all came to me and said that they wanted to collaborate with the United States in training the Afghan army. I thought that that we probably ought to try to devise some arrangement in which, at least in limited aspects, countries could participate. But the others in the administration were flatly opposed to any Iranian role. And relations between Pakistan and India at the time were at an absolute nadir. Coincident with 9/11 and the subsequent Bonn process, a Pakistani-based terrorist group had conducted a large-scale terrorist attack on the Indian Parliament, and the two countries were close to war. So very close to war. And so the idea that they would collaborate in some joint venture in Afghanistan was more difficult to conceive now then than it might be now, where relations have to some degree improved. I don't think that India and Pakistan between them would be able to substitute for the kind of assistance that the Afghan National Army are going to need from the United States and from wealthier Western countries for some time to come. To the extent the two countries, that is Pakistan and India, could agree on some form of joint collaboration in support of the Afghan army, I certainly wouldn't oppose it. But neither would I look to it to shoulder much of the load, at least in the short to medium term.
Front row.
Thanks very much. I'm Garrett Mitchell, and I write the Mitchell Report, and also a council member. I wanted to ask Ambassador Dobbin to come back to his observations about cost and risk.
Right.
And to do that in the context of American domestic political setting, which is to say that 2014 isn't just another year, it's midterms. And I wonder if there is a way to, if you have already done this or could articulate what the risks that you talk about are, and to the extent that it's doable, some sense of a risk investment ratio, and so that people can get some more specificity than saying there's this relationship between risk and cost. It's to articulate, delineate what those risks might be and what, in round numbers, investments of our resources might be to deal with those.
Well, I think there's two levels of risk. Level one is that we're no longer able to mount operations that suppress terrorist activity in either Pakistan or Afghanistan, employing drones and other forms of counter-terrorist strikes. That we can do that only as long as we have a compliant government in Kabul that's prepared to allow us to employ its territory for that purpose. It's not something we can do from aircraft carriers in the Indian Ocean. It's not something we plausibly are going to do from Uzbekistan or Tajikistan. And therefore, if we don't have a government in Kabul, which is cooperative, those kinds of activities will go away, and the ability to suppress groups that are prepared and would like to target the United States and American allies around the world would be degraded. That's risk one. The second level of risk is that you could actually return to a situation in which those kinds of terrorists were able to operate not clandestinely within a state which has weak capacity to suppress them, but on the contrary, in a state that's actively collaborating with them and is prepared to put its facilities at their disposal. You know, before 9/11, before Al-Qaeda hijacked 3 American aircraft and sent them into American buildings, they'd hijacked a whole state. They'd hijacked Afghanistan. Afghanistan was allied with Al-Qaeda. That's different from its relationship in Pakistan or Yemen or Somalia, where they operate essentially either in an area with no state or in a state that's hostile to them, but is simply incapable of suppressing them to the degree that we would like. Operating within a state that's actively compliant obviously considerably expands their capacity to plan and mount large-scale terrorist operations, as we found in September 2001. So the worst of all situations is the Taliban remain linked to Al-Qaeda, and they come back and govern the country. So that's something we want to avoid. Now, the risk of that, I don't put the risk of that very high. On the other hand, I don't put the cost of reducing that risk even further very high either. So if the risk is 5%, but you can reduce it to 3% by spending $4 billion a year, then I would argue that's probably worth $4 billion. Other people might argue, look, what did 9/11 cost us? You know, we can lose a couple of buildings every decade and a few thousand citizens rather than losing much larger amounts of money and as many citizens fighting in Afghanistan. So they'll come to a different risk calculation. I don't know that you can reduce this to a clear X% risk, so many dollars, but I do think that one has to think of it in those terms if one's going to be honest about the trade-off.
Did you want to say it? Ambassador Khan?
I just want to make one comment. You see, there is this concern that a Taliban-type government might return. To my mind, and many observers, especially in Pakistan, there is no such possibility. Afghanistan has changed, and I think Ambassador Jawad had mentioned how their concerns, their preoccupations have changed. I have not been a frequent visitor to Afghanistan, but I have seen Afghanistan of Taliban days earlier, and also I was last year in Afghanistan. And the kind of economic activity which is going on, there is a resilience now which will not allow a Taliban-type government to return. Now, the Taliban, why the country was hijacked by Al-Qaeda was that Taliban government was completely ostracized. There was not a single government except Pakistan which recognized them. So it was living in a time warp, I should say. And therefore, it was possible for Al-Qaeda to become the paymaster of the Taliban leadership and to be able to have free hand over there. I don't think that that kind of situation is ever going to return to Afghanistan. Now the world is focused on Afghanistan.
I think you're probably right, but I'd still be prepared to spend a few $1 billion to be sure you're right.
Yeah. Those you should. Those you should.
Just remember, Jim
My
is
share.
right, exactly. 1/300 millionth of a billion. Back there, please. Blue shirt. It's in the back there.
Thank you very much. I'm Iftikhar Hussain, work for Voice of America, pursuant to the Border Region Service at Scarlet River Radio. Thanks for the discussion and insight. I have two questions, and probably they're directed to Riaz Ahmed Khan. The first question is the zero-level presence of the U.S. troops or the NATO troops in Afghanistan. There is a possibility that came out yesterday. How it will be perceived in Pakistan? And the second question is, you outrightly reject the Taliban government in the coming days. So where do you see them? On the mountains, or where, on the streets of Kabul, or where they will be? Because we don't see any patch up to political setup in Afghanistan from their side, at this moment at least. So where do you see them then? Thank you very much.
Yeah, the first question about how will Pakistan see the continued U.S. presence, whatever shape it is. Now, there is one Pakistan government, it will take formal positions, accept, and I think my anticipation is they will accept whatever is the agreement between the U.S. government and the Afghan government on this issue, and this is basically a problem between these two governments. It is not a problem of Pakistan. But Pakistan is not a monolith. And you should know that there is all kinds of spectrum of views in Pakistan. And there are many in Pakistan who, I think also maybe in Afghanistan, who believe that the presence of foreign troops in Afghanistan is also sustaining the argument of the militants, that they must continue this struggle as long as the foreign forces are there. And therefore, as I had said, that there would be this perception that this issue, the continuation, may also mean the continuation of these kinds of activities, and the counter argument that these activities must stop may be weakened. But these are various groups, various parties, various people who have those kinds of views. But as far as government is concerned, I anticipate that the government will basically be accepting. The other thing is, where are the Taliban? If Taliban are nowhere, don't say that Taliban are only in Pakistan. Taliban are there in those regions. Taliban, today I find that even in Paris there has been a Taliban representation. So Taliban is part of the political landscape of Afghanistan. How they are accommodated, how this is basically is something which should be dealt by the Afghan Peace Council, the Afghan government, and whatever the others can do to help the process of reconciliation, they should do that. Pakistan gets involved, and here I may say that there is a classic book by Olaf Karo. I read it long time ago, but I off and on read it to just remind myself how intertwined is the history and the culture and the tradition and the demography of these two countries. So sometimes our problems become your problems, and your problems become our problems.
Do you want to comment on that?
Specifically on that question, I think in the contacts that take place between the Pakistani army and the Afghan government, Pakistani army position is that we should sort it out among ourselves. Let's get the American out of here. They have bigger plans. They have other attentions. So in the private meetings, that's what their position is. And I think, therefore, smaller U.S. presence privately will welcome. Publicly, there might be concern. And again, as Ambassador indicated, they're all democratic forces. There are many other forces in Pakistan that may have concern about the impact of deterioration of security in Afghanistan, which lead into further strengthening of extremist forces in Pakistan. But in the past, in the private meetings, the idea was that we're not sure about what the intention of the United States is in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Afghanistan and Pakistan should sort it out among themselves and work together to get America out of here.
Hector. My name is Javed Ahmed. I'm with the General March Fund of the United States. My question is for Ambassador Khan, and it's kind of a follow-up to the previous question. In your remarks, Mr. Ambassador, dispelling the fact that Pakistan still pursues a policy of strategic depth in Afghanistan, you said that Pakistan don't see Taliban as their strategic asset. So with that in mind, you also mentioned that there are some unrealistic expectations from Afghanistan in the United States with respect to Pakistan's future role in reaching out to some of the Taliban leadership, especially the Afghan Taliban leadership it hosts and effectively props up against U.S. and Afghan forces in Afghanistan. You said that there are some limitations in Pakistan's role. So exactly what are those limitations? Thank you.
The limitation is what I had mentioned, that we should not be expected to deliver the Taliban leadership to a position that you may be wanting them to take. That may not be possible for us. And I said that we have quite an experience of interacting with the Afghans, and the Afghans at critical times never agreed to Pakistan's point of view. This applied to the Mujahideen leadership, this applied to the Taliban themselves when they were ruling Afghanistan. So even now, to expect that Pakistan should be able to make them accept, for example, the Afghan constitution, we will not be able to do it. This is between the High Peace Council and the Afghan government and the Taliban. And how the Taliban are dealt with. This again is for the Afghans, whether they are basically debilitated and they're eroded in terms of their power, and this is the way to proceed towards reconciliation, or whether some of them are accommodated in the southern provinces. That is the part. That is again for the Afghan leadership. This is, Pakistan should not be expected, but Pakistan can be expected that we persuade, we encourage them to be part of the process. That we are trying to do probably now, and we should do that. The other thing you mentioned about this strategic depth and Taliban as an asset, I think I have already answered that. How can Taliban be an asset if they have no chance of getting into a government controlling Afghanistan, which they could not do incidentally even in 1990s when they were strong. Now, of course, the situation has completely changed. So how can they be an asset? I mean, so logically it doesn't work out, and this was never a policy. We never saw them. But we did not go after them. We did not hound them like we hounded the Al-Qaeda. Almost all the Guantanamo Bay detainees were captured in Pakistan with the help of the Pakistanis. But we did not do that with the Afghans, because Afghan Taliban is a different category. We treated them differently. We even, as I mentioned, that we wanted them to be part of the Bonn process in the beginning, at least those who were reconcilable. So the strategic depth, it was a nonsensical idea to start with, which was given in 1990, early 1990 by, unfortunately, and the army chief he made, and he did not explain it. Afterwards, there has been a retreat, but there has never been this phrase has never been part of Pakistani policy statements, ever. But This has been very catchy, and all the criticism which has come about Pakistan's policy towards Afghanistan, this figures that, look, Pakistan is seeking strategic depth. How can we seek strategic depth in Afghanistan when our security threat is vis-a-vis India? And Afghanistan certainly does not put a distance between Pakistan and India.
Isabel?
Isabel François, Atlantic Council. My question relates to NATO, and quite apart from the regular discussion NATO has on withdrawal, the new mission post-2014, there is a great deal of effort into trying to push regional cooperation post-2014. This has proven to be rather difficult, engaging Central Asians, figuring out a role for Russia. And I was wondering from actually the three panelists whether you see some role for NATO, some value added for NATO to push the regional cooperation through partnership policies, means, whether that is something that would be useful. Thank you.
You want to take it from Jim? Walk right down.
Well, I think there have been a number of summits and high-level meetings over the last couple of years that have established at least a rhetorical framework for regional cooperation, and also a framework for support for reconciliation. If it and so I think that's helpful, and I think it's worth continuing to push in this regard. There has been some improvement in relations between India and Pakistan. The border's been open to commerce in a way that it wasn't before. And these are fairly important developments. So yeah, I mean, I think that NATO's political role is probably of somewhat limited importance in terms of its actual influence, but it's certainly worth pursuing.
Would Pakistan see a positive role for NATO, or would it see it in a more negative way?
Well, Pakistan sees a positive role for the EU, for United States, for every other organization, international organization. But what is the role that NATO sees for itself? Is it military when we talk about NATO, or is it economic, or is it political? I think NATO doesn't appear to wear so many hats. Basically, when we talk about NATO, we are talking about military. Well, that I think has already been discussed. But certainly EU, other organizations, United States, everybody has a very important role, political role, economic role. I think Afghanistan would need a lot of assistance. I think NATO can also help support the Afghan army to do a better job. It would need a lot of resources. So we are in favor of that kind of role. There was one mention about the India and transit trade, etc. That will also come at a certain stage, but there are so many things which can be done if only the conflict situation gets resolved in Afghanistan and also in the border areas of Pakistan.
Ambassador Jawad, NATO's role?
Yes, specifically I think your question, ma'am, was on NATO roles in Central Asia, actually, through northern Afghanistan. I think this is a key important way of connecting Afghanistan to the rest of the world is using the Central Asia outlets. That's very important for us to reduce also our dependency on other transit routes which are becoming more and more difficult, Iran and Pakistan particularly. And definitely NATO countries, I'll put it, NATO countries will have a more important role to play than NATO as an organization, because there's a lot of sensitivity about NATO activities as an organization in Central Asia. Actually, Russians and others are suspicious about what they do. Therefore, if these roles are conducted through like the government of France or Germany or other friends and allies, it's a lot more effective. So just the framework, the modality, the vehicle should be different, because they have a lot of influence and they can help out actually a lot in connecting Afghanistan to the rest of the world through northern outlet. And one quick question, like when this route was determined, they called it Northern Distribution Network. And then I was here, the ambassador, and my favorite term is the Silk Road, because this is reviving on a traditional road instead of giving a military continuation to a trade route that has to be revived.
My name is Justyna Bartkiewicz. I'm with the Embassy of Poland here. I have a quick question to Ambassador Jawad regarding one aspect of economic development that seems to me extremely important, namely fighting the narco business in Afghanistan and in the region. This aspect will definitely affect the economic transition, economic development, and the speed and the eventual successful outcome. So could you talk a little bit about what is the current state of affairs as far as fighting narco business, what tools are being employed, and how do you see this being eventually successfully battled for the future economic development in Afghanistan? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, the environment that narco trafficking flourishes the most is the environment of uncertainty and insecurity. Mostly uncertainty, because when a farmer actually raise his orchard or his vineyard and turn it into a poppy field, because he's not sure that he has 10-15 years to maintain this orchard or vineyard. So when psychologically he's not sure what's going to happen to him and his family, he turn it into narcotics because it takes 3 months to grow it. And when you grow it, this deadly paste could be sitting across the room, does not need refrigeration, does not need economic reintegration in the region, nothing. So if we see an increased degree of uncertainty in Afghanistan, we will probably see more poppy cultivations because there will be less illicit economic activities. And again, I'm coming back to what I opened my initial statement for is the need for providing actually certainty about the future of Afghanistan, both by the Afghan leadership and the international community. So far, actually, in the areas where the economy is thriving, the economy is doing better, we have seen a reduction of narcotics and cultivation of poppy. In the areas where we see most of the fighting, that's where most of the poppy is grown.
So let me close with a final question to each of the panel. Jim, in his presentation, used a number of statistics, and I jotted a few down, but one that struck me was that, if I got it right, Jim, approximately 52% of the Afghan population thought the country was going in the right direction. So my question to each of you is, what's your view? Is the country going in the right direction, and are you optimistic or are you pessimistic as we look forward for the next 2 years and then after 2014? And why don't I just work this way?
I think if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. It really, the country is going in the right direction comparing to where we started, certainly. People feel more confident about the way their life is conducted, but yet also as I mentioned, there has to be a better formulation of strategy and definition of the role of Afghanistan in the region on the long term.
Mr. Khan?
Yeah, I also agree, and this statistics, of course, was new to me, but it is very heartening that 52% of the people in Afghanistan feel that the country is going in the right direction, because I don't know what would be the figures for Pakistan if the same question is asked. But one other thing, that some of the preoccupations in terms of thinking and concerns of the Afghans, which Ambassador Jawad mentioned, that what is the future of the country, where it stands vis-a-vis the rest of the international community, etc. These are very common questions which are asked in any other normal society, especially in the region, and this is a very positive sign. So while the situation may be a bit fluid, there may be uncertainties, there may be risks and dangers, I think there are also very definitive positive signs, and I experienced them when I visited Afghanistan last year. It was a very different Afghanistan than I had been visiting, say, 5 years or 6 years or during the Taliban period.
Kim?
Well, I think most of the trend lines in Afghanistan are positive. Most of the ones that you can detect using empirical data. I'm not sure that the trend lines in American policy are necessarily quite so positive. And obviously there's an interaction between the two. Just to end with a few other statistics, to basically agree with Ambassador Khan that the situation there has changed pretty fundamentally since 2001. Today, 4/5 of Afghan households have radios. 1/2 of Afghan households have TVs. And 3/4 of Afghan households have telephones. those statistics, maybe for radio, they might have been fairly high in 2001. For TVs and telephones, they would have been zero, outside of a few people in Kabul, I would guess. So, you know, as Ambassador Jawad said, they are connected with each other and with the rest of the world in ways that are just completely different from where they were 10 years ago. And I think on balance, that's a positive.
So we're going to end on a positive note, and let me thank the panel, each of whom has been extraordinarily positive in terms of very thoughtful, very useful presentations. I really appreciate it very much. Thank the audience very much for coming, and we're concluded now. Thank you very much.